She stood there every night for a week, and on the 7th, she waited for him to follow. Before we continue, tell me, where are you watching from tonight? Somewhere quiet, somewhere with wind outside your window, because out here, silence carries farther than words, and some things don't knock before they arrive. Ethan Cole had lived alone on that stretch of dry land for 6 long years, 40 acres of dust, fence posts leaning like tired men, and a house that creaked just enough to remind him it was still standing. He wasn't the kind to imagine things. Ranch work didn't leave room for that. You woke with the sun, you worked until your hands forgot what rest felt like, and by nightfall, your bones were too heavy to question shadows. But on a Tuesday night, just past 9 p.m., when the last light had slipped behind the hills and the air turned cold enough to sting, Ethan saw her. She stood 20 yards beyond the fence, just where the land dipped into darker soil. A girl, maybe mid-20s, long hair falling still against her shoulders, pale dress catching what little moonlight there was. She wasn't moving, not shifting, just watching. Ethan didn't step outside that night. He stood behind the window, one hand resting on the frame, eyes narrowed like he could force her into making sense. Folks didn't wander this far out. Not without reason, not without noise. And she made none. By the time he reached for his hat, she was gone. Next night, same time, she was back. Same spot, same stillness. This time, he opened the door. The hinges gave a low groan, loud enough to break most silences, but not hers. She didn't flinch, didn't call out, just watched him like she'd been waiting. Ethan took one step off the porch, boots pressing into dry dirt. The wind shifted, and she took one step back. Not running, not afraid, just retreating, like distance was part of some rule he didn't understand. Third night, fourth, fifth, she returned. Always at 9 o'clock. Always quiet. Always gone the moment he tried to close the space between them. By the 6th night, Ethan stopped pretending it didn't matter. He left the door open before sunset, sat there in the dim light, hat in his hands, waiting. But she didn't come. Not that night. The silence felt heavier than before, like something had been removed that didn't belong to him, but left a mark anyway. He didn't sleep. Not really. Just sat there, listening to the wind scrape along the fence line, eyes drifting back to that empty spot. And somewhere between midnight and dawn, a thought settled in that didn't feel like his own. Maybe she wasn't avoiding him. Maybe she was waiting for him to stop holding back. On the 7th night, at exactly 9 p.m., she returned. Same place, same stillness. But this time, she didn't step back. The wind did not move her dress this time. And that was the first thing Ethan noticed as he stepped off the porch, slow, deliberate, each boot pressing into the dry ground like he was testing whether it would hold him or give way beneath something unseen. And she did not retreat, not an inch, not a breath, just stood there with her eyes fixed on him in a way that felt less like being watched and more like being remembered. The distance between them stayed the same for a moment, stretched thin, like a wire pulled too tight, until Ethan took another step and the sound of gravel under his heels seemed louder than it should have been in the open night, louder than the rustling fence, louder than the wind that had gone strangely still again, and still she did not move, which was wrong, because every other night she had kept that invisible line between them intact, as if crossing it would break something neither of them could fix. He stopped 10 yards from the fence, close enough now to see the shape of her face more clearly, the pale outline, the calm in her expression that did not belong to someone alone in the dark. And for the first time he noticed something else, something small but sharp enough to settle in his chest like a question he could not ignore. Her eyes were not searching, not curious, not afraid. They were certain, as if she had already seen this moment before it happened. Ethan swallowed slowly, the dryness in his throat catching like dust, and he raised his voice, just enough to carry across the space between them, asking a simple question that should have felt ordinary, asking who she was and what she was doing out here. But the words did not land the way he expected. They seemed to fall short, like the night itself refused to carry them all the way to her. And she did not answer, not with words, not with movement, only that steady gaze that held him in place longer than he cared to admit. A second passed, then another, and then she did something different, something small enough that a man might miss it if he blinked. She turned her head slightly, not away from him but toward the tree line behind her, and when her eyes returned to his, there was something new in them, not distance, not warning, but invitation, quiet and unspoken, the kind that does not ask twice. Ethan felt it before he understood it, that pull, not from fear, not from curiosity alone, but from somewhere deeper, something tied to nights he could not remember clearly and choices he had stopped thinking about years ago, and before he could stop himself, before that old rule in his mind could catch up and pull him back, he took another step forward, closing the space between them to just a few feet, close enough now to see the faint details of her dress, the way it hung too still, too clean for the land around them, and the way her hair did not shift with the breeze that brushed past his own shoulder. He reached the fence and placed his hand on the top rail, the wood rough beneath his palm, grounding him for a second, giving him something real to hold on to. And when he looked up again, she was already moving, not running, not even turning fully, just stepping back into the dark beyond the fence. One step, then another, slow and certain, as if she knew he would follow this time, as if she had been waiting not for him to see her, but for him to choose to step beyond what he knew and into whatever waited just past that line. Ethan hesitated only long enough to feel the weight of that choice settle in his chest, and then he lifted his hand from the fence, stepped over it, and followed her into the night where the ground softened under his boots and the world behind him seemed to fall quiet, in a way that made it feel farther than 40 acres away. The ground changed the moment Ethan crossed the fence, not in a way a man could explain, but in the way his boots sank just a little deeper, the dust giving way to something cooler, softer, as if the land itself remembered something the rest of the world had forgotten, and ahead of him Lydia moved without sound, her steps light, almost weightless, never looking back yet never losing him either, like she knew exactly how far he would go before doubt caught up. The trees closed in slowly, thin at first, scattered, then thicker, their branches stretching overhead until the sky above narrowed to strips of pale light, and Ethan felt the distance from his house settle behind him not in miles, but in something heavier, something quieter, like a door had shut without a sound. He tried once more to speak, her name still unknown on his tongue, asking again who she was, what she wanted, why she kept coming to his land night after night. But again his voice seemed to fall short, swallowed by the stillness that followed her like a shadow, and she answered only with movement, a slight turn of her head, a shift in her path deeper into the trees, guiding without asking. Ethan kept walking, each step slower than the last, not from fear, not exactly, but from the weight of something rising in the back of his mind, a feeling that he had walked this direction before, that these trees had once stood around him in a different night, under a different sky, and that thought pressed against his memory like a door he had kept shut for years. The air grew cooler as they moved, the scent of dry earth fading into something older, something like damp wood and forgotten rain. And then she stopped, sudden and absolute, her stillness cutting through the quiet like a line drawn in the dirt, and Ethan nearly stepped into her before he caught himself, his boots stopping inches from where she stood. For a moment neither of them moved, and then, slowly, she turned, not fully, just enough for him to see her face clearer than before, pale but not empty, calm but not distant, her eyes holding something that made his chest tighten without warning. Not fear, not anger, but recognition that did not belong to him. She lifted her hand then, a small motion, barely more than a breath, and pointed past him, toward a patch of ground just off the narrow path where the trees opened slightly and the earth dipped low, and Ethan followed her gesture, his gaze shifting away from her for the first time since he stepped into the trees. And when he looked down, he saw it, the outline of something old, wood-worn thin, edges softened by time, a shape that did not belong to chance. His breath slowed, then caught, because even before he stepped closer, even before the details came into focus, something inside him already knew what waited there, and the closer he moved, the heavier that knowing became, settling into his bones like a truth he had buried once and never meant to uncover again, until at last he stood at the edge of it, looking down at the weathered wood set into the earth. And behind him, Lydia did not move, did not speak, only watched, as if this moment had been waiting far longer than he had. The wood was gray with age, edges worn smooth by years of wind and quiet neglect, and for a long moment Ethan did not move, did not breathe any deeper than he had to, because the shape in the ground was no longer just a shape. It was memory pressing up through dirt he had told himself was settled, finished, done with. He stepped closer, slow, careful, as if the ground might shift beneath him if he moved too quickly. And the faint outline of a cross came into focus, crude, hand-cut, the kind a man makes when there is no time and no one else around to witness it. And that was when his chest tightened, sharp and sudden, because he knew that cross, not from sight alone but from the weight of the moment it had come from, a night carried by storm and wind, and something he had locked away so completely he had almost convinced himself it had never happened. Ethan crouched down, one knee pressing into the soft earth, and reached out, his fingers hovering just above the wood before finally touching it, the surface cool, dry, real, grounding him in a way that made the rest of the night feel less certain. And as his hand settled there, something shifted inside him, not a sound, not a vision, but a pull, a memory rising slow and heavy like water filling a space he had tried to keep empty. He remembered the rain first, hard and cold, the kind that blurred the edges of everything, the kind that made distance impossible to measure, and then the figure, barely visible through the storm, a girl collapsed near the tree line, her dress soaked, her breathing shallow, and he had gone to her without thinking, lifting her from the mud with hands that knew work but not gentleness, carrying her back toward shelter that felt miles farther than it should have. He remembered speaking to her, asking questions she did not answer, or maybe could not, her eyes opening once, just once, meeting his with something he could not place then and could not forget now. And he had told himself he would get her through the night. That morning would bring help, answers, something more than what he could offer alone. But morning had come quiet, too quiet, and she had not moved, not spoken, not breathed in a way he could hold on to. And the land had felt bigger that day, emptier, like it had taken something and kept it without asking. Ethan's hand tightened slightly against the wood, his jaw setting as the rest came back, not in pieces now, but in a single, steady line. The way he had chosen this spot because it was the only ground soft enough to dig, the way he had worked until his arms burned and his breath came short, the way he had placed her there with care he did not understand at the time, marking the place with this same rough cross because leaving nothing felt worse than leaving something incomplete. He had not known her name, had not known where she came from, and so he had left that part empty, telling himself it did not matter, telling himself that what he had done was enough, that the land would take the rest. Behind him, Lydia stood silent, and Ethan did not need to turn to know she was there, did not need to see her to feel the weight of her presence settle into that memory now fully awake, fully undeniable. And when he finally looked up from the cross, his voice came quieter than before, rough with something he had not used in years, asking a question that no longer felt simple, asking who she was not out of suspicion now, but out of something closer to understanding. And this time, the silence that followed did not feel empty. It felt like it was waiting. She did not answer right away, and that silence carried more weight than any word he could have expected, because now it was no longer empty. It was full, filled with everything he had just remembered and everything he had chosen to forget. And when Lydia finally moved, it was not away from him this time, but closer, one step forward that brought her within arm's reach, close enough that Ethan could see the faint lines of her face more clearly, the calm in her eyes that did not belong to the living or the lost, but something in between, something that had waited longer than it should have had to. She looked down at the cross, then back at him, and when she spoke, her voice was soft, steady, and carried through the still air without resistance, as if the night itself made space for it. You remembered the ground, but not me. And the words settled into him deeper than the memory had, because they were not accusing, not sharp, just true in a way that left no room to step around it. Ethan's throat tightened, and he shifted his weight slightly, his hand still resting on the weathered wood, as if letting go might break something fragile that had just surfaced. And he tried to answer, tried to explain that he had done what he could, that he had stayed, that he had not walked away, but the words did not come out the way he intended. They felt smaller than the moment, thinner than the truth standing in front of him. Lydia watched him without interruption, her gaze steady, not pushing, not forgiving, just holding him there in the space between what had been done and what had been left undone. And then she lifted her hand again, slowly, and pointed not at the cross this time, but at the space just beneath it, where the earth had settled unevenly over the years, where something small lay half-hidden in the dirt. Ethan followed her gesture, his eyes narrowing slightly as he leaned closer, brushing aside loose soil with careful fingers until he uncovered it, a piece of cloth, worn and faded but unmistakable, and his breath caught again because he knew it immediately. The pattern, the stitching, the way it folded in his hand. It was his, the handkerchief he had carried for years, the one he thought he had lost long before that storm, and yet here it was, tucked into the ground as if it had been placed there on purpose, as if it had always belonged. With her, he turned it over slowly, the fabric dry but intact, and something inside him shifted again, sharper this time, clearer, because he remembered now not just the night but the moment before the end, the way she had reached for his hand, not with strength but with intention, pressing something into his palm, something he had not looked at then, too focused on keeping her breathing, too certain there would be time later to understand. And there had not been. Ethan exhaled slowly, the sound rough in the quiet. And when he looked up at Lydia again, there was no distance left in his expression, only recognition, full and undeniable, and something heavier beneath it, something like regret that had been waiting for a name. Lydia, he said, the word unfamiliar and yet certain, and she did not react with surprise or relief, only a slight shift in her gaze, as if hearing it spoken aloud had settled something that had been held too long, and for the first time since she appeared. The air around them changed, subtle but real, the stillness easing just enough to let the night breathe again, and Ethan felt it, not as fear, not as confusion, but as understanding beginning to take shape, slow and steady, like the first light before dawn. The name did not echo, did not drift into the trees. It settled between them like something that had finally found where it belonged, and Lydia lowered her eyes for the briefest moment, not in sadness, not in relief, but in acknowledgment, as if a long waiting had reached its end without needing to say so out loud. Ethan remained still, the handkerchief clenched loosely in his hand, the rough edge of it pressing against his palm, grounding him in a way that made everything else feel less certain. And he searched her face again, not for answers now, but for something he had missed before, something that might explain why she had come back, why she had stood at his fence night after night without a word, why she had waited until he chose to follow. Why now? He asked quietly, the question not demanding, just honest. And Lydia looked past him for a moment, toward the direction of his land, though the trees blocked any clear view, and when she spoke again her voice carried that same steady calm. Because you finally looked. And the words lingered, simple, but heavier than they should have been, because they were not about seeing her, not really. They were about everything he had refused to see for years. Ethan exhaled slowly, his gaze dropping back to the cross, to the uneven earth beneath it, and for the first time he noticed how incomplete it looked, not broken, not neglected, just unfinished, like a sentence that had stopped before it said what it needed to say. And that realization settled into him deeper than regret, deeper than memory, because it pointed to something still within his reach, something he had not lost entirely. Lydia stepped closer then, the space between them closing without hesitation, and she lowered herself slightly, not kneeling, not fully, just enough to place her hand lightly over the wood of the cross, her fingers resting where his had been moments before, and though their hands did not touch, Ethan felt it, a quiet connection, not physical but certain, like two lines finally meeting after running apart for too long. You gave me a place, she said, her voice softer now, but you left me without a name. And there was no blame in it, no sharp edge, only a truth that asked to be completed, and Ethan felt the weight of that more clearly than anything else, because it was not about what he had done wrong. It was about what he had not finished. The wind returned then, slow and steady, brushing through the trees, carrying with it the scent of dry earth and something lighter beneath it. And for the first time since he had followed her into the woods, Ethan felt the night move again, not frozen, not waiting, but shifting forward. He looked at the cross once more, at the empty space where a name should have been, and his grip tightened slightly on the handkerchief before he unfolded it, smoothing the worn fabric with careful fingers, as if handling something more fragile than cloth. And when he lifted his eyes back to Lydia, There was no confusion left in them, no hesitation, only a quiet understanding of what she had come to ask. "I did not know your name," he said, the words. Steady now, not as an excuse but as a beginning, and Lydia met his gaze, holding it. And for the first time, there was something like warmth in her expression, faint but real. "You do now," she answered, and the space between them felt different after that. Not distant, not uncertain, but complete in a way that did not need anything more to be said, only something to be done. For a long moment, Ethan did not move, because now that he understood, movement felt heavier than before, like every step from here on carried more than just his weight. And he looked at the cross again, at the empty space where her name should have been, and he realized something simple, something that had been there all along but never fully seen, that leaving it blank had not been an act of respect, it had been distance, a quiet way of stepping back from a story he did not want to carry. The wind moved through the trees again, slower now, brushing past his shoulders, and he rose from where he knelt, the joints in his legs stiff, not from time, but from the weight of what he was choosing next. And Lydia stepped back just enough to give him space, not retreating, not guiding this time, simply watching as if this part belonged to him alone. Ethan glanced once toward the direction of his ranch, though it was hidden beyond the dark, and for a second, he considered the distance, the tools he would need, the daylight he might wait for. But the thought passed quickly, because some things did not wait for morning. Some things needed to be done while the truth was still clear and the silence still held. He moved toward the edge of the clearing, toward a fallen branch he had passed on the way. Dry but solid, about 3 feet long. And he picked it up, testing its weight in his hands, then turned back toward the cross, the ground beneath his boots steady now, as if it recognized what he had decided. Lydia remained where she was, her presence quiet but no longer distant. And as Ethan knelt again beside the cross, he placed the branch against the wood, positioning it carefully, not with urgency, but with a kind of attention that came from understanding the moment rather than rushing through it. And then, slowly, he began to carve, the rough edge of the branch scraping against the weathered surface, each mark deliberate, each line steady, not perfect, but certain. The sound was small, almost lost in the open air, but to Ethan it felt louder than anything else that night, because it was the first time he had added something instead of leaving something undone. And as the letters began to take shape, one by one, he did not look up, did not pause, even when the wood resisted, or the lines came out uneven, because this was not about precision, it was about completion. L, then Y, then D, the shapes forming slowly, and with each letter something inside him settled, something that had been out of place for years finding its way back into line. And when he reached the last letter, A, he paused just long enough to look at it, to see the name fully there where before there had been nothing. And the weight of it was not heavy now, it was quiet, steady, like something that no longer needed to be carried. Ethan set the branch aside and brushed his hand lightly over the carved name, clearing away the loose dust, and then he sat back on his heels, exhaling slowly, the air leaving his chest in a way that felt different than before, less tight, less held. When he finally looked up, Lydia was still there, but something had changed, subtle, almost unnoticeable at first, the edges of her form softer, less defined against the dark, like the night was beginning to take her back in a way that was not abrupt but inevitable. And she met his gaze one last time, not with distance now, not with waiting, but with something close to peace. And for the first time since she had appeared at his fence, she gave the smallest nod, not asking, not guiding, just acknowledging that what had been left unfinished was no longer waiting. The nod was small, almost easy to miss, but it carried more finality than anything she had done before, and Ethan felt it the moment it happened, not in his eyes but somewhere deeper, like a door closing gently instead of slamming shut. And he remained where he was for a second longer, his hand resting lightly on the carved name, as if confirming it was real, as if making sure it would not fade the moment he looked away. When he finally lifted his gaze again, Lydia had not disappeared, not yet. But she was different now, her outline less certain against the trees, the edges of her form blending into the dark in a way that felt natural, not sudden, like something returning to where it had always belonged. She did not step back this time, did not turn away. She simply stood there, watching him one last time, and there was no question left in her eyes, no waiting, only a quiet stillness that did not ask for anything more. Ethan rose slowly, brushing the dirt from his hands without looking down, his attention fixed on her as if memorizing the way she stood there, the way the night held her without resistance. And for a moment he thought about speaking, about saying something that might hold her there a little longer, but the thought passed as quickly as it came, because there was nothing left that needed to be said. The wind moved through the clearing again, a little stronger now, carrying the dry scent of the land back into the space between them, and as it passed, Lydia's form shifted with it, not like a person stepping aside, but like light fading at the edge of day, gradual, certain, and Ethan did not move, did not reach out, because he understood now that this was not something to hold on to. It was something to let finish. Her gaze remained on him until the very last moment, steady and calm, and then, without a sound, without a step, she was no longer there. The space she had occupied empty in a way that did not feel hollow, just complete. The clearing seemed larger without her, the trees quieter, the air moving more freely, and Ethan stood there for a long moment, listening, not for her return, but for the absence of what had been waiting all these years, and finding that it was gone. He turned back to the cross slowly, his eyes settling on the name carved into the wood, the letters uneven but clear, and he stepped closer again, reaching out to touch it once more, not to check if it was real this time, but as a gesture, something simple and certain, and he left the handkerchief there, folding it neatly at the base of the cross, pressing it lightly into the earth as if returning it to where it belonged. When he straightened, the weight he had carried into the trees was no longer there, not gone completely, but changed, lighter in a way that did not need to be measured, and he took a step back, then another, his boots finding the path without effort, the way out no longer hidden or uncertain. The trees seemed thinner now, the sky above wider, and as he walked, the faint outline of his land began to return through the dark, the fence line, the shape of the house, all of it exactly where he had left it, but not quite the same. Ethan stopped once at the edge of the trees and looked back, not expecting to see her, not hoping to, just acknowledging the place, the ground, the moment that had shifted something he had carried too long. And then he turned and stepped over the fence, back onto his land, where the wind moved freely again and the night felt like it belonged to the present instead of the past. The house looked the same from a distance, the porch leaning slightly to the left, the windows catching what little moonlight remained, and the fence stretching across the land like a quiet boundary that had not moved in years. Yet as Ethan stepped closer, something about it felt different, not in shape or size, but in weight, as if the land itself no longer held on to what it had been carrying before. He crossed the yard slowly, boots brushing through dry grass, the familiar creak of the porch, boards greeting him like it always had. But this time it did not feel like something holding him in place. It felt like something simply there, existing without expectation. He paused at the doorway, hand resting on the frame, and for a moment he listened, not for footsteps, not for movement, but for that quiet presence that had lingered around the edges of his nights these past days. And there was nothing, only the wind moving freely through the open land, uninterrupted, steady, real. Ethan stepped inside, leaving the door open behind him without thinking, the hinges shifting softly as they always did, and he moved through the room with slow familiarity, his eyes passing over the table, the chair, the small things that had filled his days without ever asking for more than routine. And for the first time in a long while, the silence inside the house did not feel heavy. It did not press against him or follow him from corner to corner. It simply existed, quiet and even. He set his hat down on the table, then stopped, his hand lingering there a second longer than needed, because something in him expected to hear something behind him. A step, a presence, the faint shift of air that would tell him he was not alone. But nothing came, and that absence did not unsettle him. It settled him. He walked to the window next, the same one he had stood behind on those first nights, and he looked out toward the fence line, toward the place where she had stood, the spot still visible under the pale light, unchanged in every way except one. It was no longer waiting, and neither was he. The memory of her did not vanish. It did not fade into something distant or unclear. It remained, but it no longer pulled at him, no longer asked him to follow. It simply stayed where it belonged, tied to the place beyond the trees, tied to the name now carved into wood instead of left in silence. Ethan exhaled slowly, a breath that felt fuller than the ones before, and he turned away from the window, moving back toward the center of the room, his steps steady, unhurried. As if the need to fill time had eased without him noticing, he reached for the lantern, lighting it with practiced hands, the small flame growing steady, casting soft light across the walls, and as it settled, so did the space around him, no longer shaped by what had been missing, no longer defined by something unfinished. He moved to the door again, standing there for a moment with the night open in front of him, the land stretching out quiet and wide, and instead of closing it, he left it as it was, open to the wind, open to the dark, not out of habit, not out of expectation, but because it no longer mattered whether something stood outside or not. Ethan stepped back inside, the light behind him steady, the silence around him even, and somewhere beyond the trees, where the ground dipped and the cross stood with a name now carved into it. Something that had waited for years had finally come to rest, and out here, that was the only kind of justice that ever stayed. Morning came slow across the land, the kind of light that did not rush, just eased its way over the fence line and into the open fields, touching everything without asking for notice. And Ethan was already awake before it reached the porch, sitting in the same chair by the window where he had spent so many nights watching something he did not understand. The lantern had burned low, its flame reduced to a faint glow, and the house carried that quiet stillness that only comes after something has ended without noise. He did not move right away, did not reach for his hat or step outside like he usually did at first light. Instead, he sat there, hands resting loosely in his lap, eyes fixed on the place beyond the fence where the land dipped out of sight. And for the first time, he was not waiting for anything to appear there. The absence was clear, steady, and complete, not unsettling, not hollow, just present in a way that felt settled. After a while, he stood, the motion unhurried, and stepped out onto the porch, the boards creaking softly under his weight as they always had. But the sound did not carry the same echo it once did. It felt contained, part of the morning instead of something marking time. The air was cooler now, carrying the scent of dry grass and distant earth, and Ethan took it in without thinking, his gaze sweeping across the land not as someone searching, but as someone seeing it again for what it was, open, quiet, and no longer holding something unfinished. Beneath its surface, he walked out into the yard, boots brushing through the thin layer of dust, and stopped at the fence, resting his hand on the top rail, just as he had the night before. But this time there was no hesitation, no question of what lay beyond it, only a quiet acknowledgment of where he had been and what had been left behind there. He did not cross it, not today, because there was no need. The path had already been taken, the distance already closed. Instead, he stood there for a moment. Longer, looking out at the tree line, the shadows now lighter, less dense under the rising sun, and he let his eyes settle on that place without expectation, without the pull that had drawn him forward before. After a while, he turned back toward the house, the motion simple, natural, and as he stepped onto the porch again, he reached for the door and paused, his hand resting against it as the morning light filled the space behind him. He considered closing it, the habit still there, the routine of shutting out the night. But then he left it open again, not because he was waiting, not because he expected anything to return, but because there was nothing left that needed to be kept out or held in. The house behind him was quiet, the land in front of him steady, and somewhere beyond the trees, where the cross stood with a name now carved into it, something that had once lingered without rest had found its place. And that quiet carried across the acres without needing to be seen or spoken, settling into the kind of peace that did not ask for attention, only for someone to finally let it stay. By midday, the sun had burned the last of the morning chill off the land, and Ethan moved through his work with a steadiness that had not been there before, not faster, not lighter in effort, but clearer, like each task belonged exactly where it was without pulling at anything else inside him. He checked the fence line first, walking its length with measured steps, stopping where posts leaned or wire had loosened, setting them right with quiet attention. And every now and then his gaze drifted, past the boundary toward the trees, not searching, not expecting, just acknowledging the distance that no longer felt like something unfinished. The wind carried across the open field in long, even passes, lifting dust in soft trails that settled just as easily. And Ethan found himself noticing things he had overlooked before. The way the ground shifted slightly near the far end of the property, the way the light moved across the boards of the barn, the way silence could exist without pressing against him. He worked through the afternoon without interruption, mending what needed mending, tending to the small details that kept the place standing. And when he paused for water, he leaned against the same post where he had once stood watching the nights stretch longer than they should have. But now the memory of those nights felt placed, not lingering, like something set down where it belonged instead of carried from one day to the next. As the sun began its slow descent, the light turning softer, stretching shadows across the land, Ethan made his way back toward the house, his steps unhurried, his shoulders no longer carrying that quiet tension that had once settled there without him noticing. He climbed the porch and stepped inside, the door still open behind him, the air moving freely through the space as it had since morning, and he paused just inside, looking out once more toward the fence line, toward the place where the land dipped beyond sight. The thought of going back there crossed his mind, not out of need, not out of uncertainty, but out of something simpler, a recognition of where something had been finished, and he knew he would return, not tonight, not out of urgency, but because some places deserved to be visited again when the weight of them had settled into something quieter. He reached for his hat and set it down on the table again, the same small motion as the night before, but without hesitation this time, without the pause that had once come with it. And as the light outside began to fade into evening, Ethan moved through the house with the same steady rhythm as before, preparing for the night without thinking about what it might bring. When he stepped back onto the porch, the sky was already deepening, the first signs of night settling across the horizon, and he stood there for a moment, not waiting, not watching for anything to appear, just standing in the space between day and dark, where everything felt even and complete. The wind moved across the land again, carrying nothing with it but the quiet of the open fields, and Ethan let it pass without turning, without stepping forward, because for the first time in years, there was nothing left in the night that needed him to follow. The night returned the same way it always had, slow and quiet, stretching across the land without asking permission. But this time it did not carry that familiar pull, that subtle weight that used to sit just beyond the edge of Ethan's thoughts. And as the last light faded from the sky, he remained on the porch a little longer than usual, not out of habit, not out of expectation, but because the stillness felt different now, like something that could finally be left alone. The stars began to appear one by one, faint at first, then clearer as the darkness settled, and the land beneath them seemed wider, less confined by memory, less tied to something unseen. Ethan leaned against the post at the edge of the porch, arms resting loosely, his gaze drifting toward the fence line, toward that familiar spot where she had once stood, and he let his eyes stay there for a moment, not searching for movement, not waiting for a figure to take shape, just acknowledging the place as it was now, empty but not lacking. The wind moved across the open ground in a steady rhythm, brushing against the wood, the grass, the quiet edges of the house, and for the first time in a long while, that sound did not carry anything with it. No question, no memory pressing forward, only the simple presence of the night itself. After a while, Ethan stepped back inside, the motion unhurried, and he left the door open again, the way he had since morning, not out of defiance, not out of hope, but because there was nothing left that needed to be kept out or held in. The lantern cast a soft glow across the room, steady and even, and he moved through the space with quiet familiarity, setting things in place, preparing for rest without the weight of something unfinished following him from one step to the next. He paused once more by the window, looking out into the dark, and though the land beyond the fence was harder to see now, he did not feel the need to focus on it, did not feel that quiet pull that had once drawn his attention night after night, because whatever had waited there had already been answered. He turned away from the window then, moving toward the chair, and sat down slowly, the wood creaking beneath him in a way that felt grounded, real. And as he rested there, The silence inside the house settled around him without pressing in, without closing off the space, just existing in a way that felt balanced. Time passed without measure, the kind that did not need to be counted. And when Ethan finally stood again, it was not because something had drawn him up, but because the night had reached that quiet point where rest came naturally. He walked to the doorway one last time, looking out across the land, the horizon, barely visible now. And for a brief moment, he let his eyes settle where the trees stood in the distance, not expecting anything, not asking anything, just remembering without weight. Then he stepped back, reached for the edge of the door, and paused, his hand resting there as the wind moved softly through the opening. And instead of closing it, he left it as it was, the night moving freely through the space, because some doors, once opened for the right reason, were never meant to be shut. Again, not out of fear, not out of habit, but out of understanding. The night passed without interruption, and when morning returned, it did not feel like a continuation of something heavy. It felt like something new settling into place, quiet and steady, and Ethan woke without that familiar pull at the edge of his thoughts, without that sense that something unfinished was waiting just beyond the reach of his land. He stepped outside as the first lights spread across the fields, the sky opening wide above him. And for a moment he simply stood there, taking in the stillness, not searching for change, not measuring what had shifted, but recognizing it in the way the air moved, in the way his chest felt. Lighter without needing to understand why. The fence line stretched out ahead of him, unchanged, and beyond it the trees stood as they always had, holding their quiet space where something had once lingered, and Ethan knew without needing to see it that the cross still stood there, the name carved into it, now part of the land, part of the story that no longer needed to be carried by him alone. He moved through the morning as he always did, checking the small things, setting the day in motion. But there was a difference in the way he did it, not in speed or effort, but in presence, each step belonging fully to the moment instead of being pulled backward by something left unresolved. As the sun rose higher, he found himself at the edge of the fence again, not out of habit this time, not out of some quiet instinct, but because the path there felt natural, like returning to a place that had changed meaning without changing shape. He rested his hand on the top rail, looking out toward the trees, and for a brief moment, he allowed himself to remember, not the uncertainty, not the confusion, but the stillness of that final moment, the way she had looked at him without asking for anything more. And he understood now that what had passed between them had never been about being seen. It had been about being finished. Ethan stood there a little longer, then stepped back, turning toward the house with the same calm certainty that had settled into everything else. And as he walked, the land felt open in a way it had not before, not because something had been added, but because something had been allowed to rest. He reached the porch and paused, glancing once more across the distance.